All right, let's go ahead and get started today. We are moving now into the period prior to the Reformation. So for this week and next week, and then the last class after Thanksgiving break, we'll be focusing on this period leading up to the Reformation. We'll even highlight some things in that next period a little bit to see how some of these things have kind of culminated, had worked themselves out before we end. With that, I want to remind you that the 5th primary source essay is due this Friday, if you've not completed that already. Don't forget as well that the Rule of Faith essay is due next Thursday, the 17th, and then a week after Thanksgiving, the last set summaries and the last primary source essay. So a lot of things coming up over the next couple of weeks. So we're moving now into roughly the period from the 13th century to the 16th century, setting the stage for the Reformation, but then also seeing some things that worked themselves out from what had been occurring beforehand. We come into a period then that begins a lot of changes. And for the next 300 years, there were quite a bit of changes that took place. In many respects, what the Reformation represents is a major change in Christianity. There was quite a bit of shift when Martin Luther first presented the 95 Theses to debate some traditional Catholic teaching. But in many respects, some of the things that he was condemning and fighting against were things that were developing in the years before that. And the unrest that gives birth to the Reformation was not something that just suddenly appeared on October 31st, 1517, but it's been things that have been developing for a while. And especially in the period that we're looking at now. In this period, we're talking the beginnings of the Renaissance, we're talking about the beginnings of the printing press, a variety of different changes that will have a significant impact, not just on the political side and the cultural side, but also in Christianity as well. Largely, this was a time where there were a lot of social changes taking place, social changes that have had a profound impact on a variety of things, including Christianity. One of those was the development of a monetary economy, things like credit and trade and manufacturing. Certainly there had been business transactions of a sort prior to this, but this is an economic shift. Now because of this, you have the development of what will become known as the middle class, or in the French terminology, the bourgeoisie. With that, this class in between the aristocrats and the serfs or the peasants, there is a challenge that they represent, especially to the aristocrats. And so as monetary economy develops, where power resides in things like finances and credit instead of agriculture, that's going to lead to some struggles. And so the bourgeoisie struggled with the aristocracy over who should have power in society. There's questions here of taxes and authority. And ultimately, the bourgeoisie wanted a strong centralized government instead of nobles ruling over different areas, believing that this would be a type of government that would favor them or give them more power. It's also a time where we begin to see the rise of modern nation states, places like France and England specifically. Spain is still divided because we're talking about this. The Reconquista took several centuries to take place, and then toward the end of the period we're looking at now, it will finally be finished. Germany, of course, there is still also division because it is a part of the Holy Roman Empire. But during the 14th and 15th century, you see the rise of several monarchies. You see the rise of people being committed to the nations that are arising. Instead of just having a local identity related to where you lived, the Lord that you serve, now people are starting to think of themselves in terms of a country or nation. That, of course, brings with it some challenges because there's this notion of a commonality with other people within that nation against other people in other nations. You also have during this time the rise of cities, the increase of numbers of cities. For example, in 1300, in the region known that will later be known as Germany, there were 800 cities. By 1500, there are 3,000 cities, with Cologne, Germany being the largest of 50,000 people. Each of these nations would have a different view of the relationship to the papacy. Some nations would be closely tied to the papacy. Some nations would be less tied. Some nations the other way as well. The Pope would heavily rely on, would need the support of. And then other nations, they would have strained relationships. Some of that we'll touch on Thursday. But as these nations developed, there began to be these questions of the authority in a local region versus the authority of an emperor or even the Pope. It was also a time of increased trade, specifically looking for routes to the Baltic regions, to China, to other places that would provide increased wealth. So you have the revival of urban life, as we've already touched on, the rise of guilds, where groups of individuals would congregate around a specific trade. Banking, of course, becoming very important. The rise of a merchant class, which, as we've already talked about, would lead to clashes between the merchants and nobles. On the other side, though, sometimes some of those things led to other problems. Beginning in the 14th century, there were several moments of economic and social disruption and disease. Some of that was simply famine. For example, there were poor harvests and famines in the early 1300s. Some of that was the social unrest and dissatisfaction with the nobles that we talked about. But then, of course, a very major important development was the prevalence of the bubonic plague. And of course, now we understand that it was carried by rats, or particularly the fleas on rats, which came to the west from the east, particularly from the Black Sea region, somewhere in the middle of the 14th century. This ultimately was the downside of trade. While trade could bring wealth, trade could bring greater opportunities to connect with people in other parts of the world, it could also, on the other hand, bring diseases back. And as the bubonic plague spread to the western part of Europe, most of the people had no immunity to it. Additionally, we're talking about a period where there's not a lot of medical knowledge, so it's not even sure where it comes from, how to stop it spreading. It was called the Black Plague, or the Black Death, because as the disease progressed, black blisters would form on people. There would be very quick symptoms once infected: loss of balance, a fever, swollen lymph nodes, and even dementia. Many of the people who encountered it died within 5 days, often many of them young. From 1347 to 1350, it's estimated that Europe lost 1/4 of its population. Some communities even lost over 1/3 of their people. A rather sizable number of people that are dying to this plague. And the outbreaks would continue every 10 to 12 years or so, which would disrupt society, economics, and politics as well, as people look to their political leaders for relief. There were, however, religious consequences as well because of the Black Plague. In some places, the clergy appeared to have been hit very hard. Sometimes as much as half the clergy in certain populations died from the Black Plague. Again, not clear why per se. There doesn't seem to be any particular rhyme or reason. It just appears that these individuals were hit. Now, maybe in some sense we might say, well, if they were monastic and they're living kind of a very ascetic lifestyle, so their health isn't that good anyway, maybe that might be why clergy would be harder hit if they were monastic. But in other cases, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the case. So one of the consequences was the decreased number of people to perform religious rituals, to preach, etc. Additionally, we talked last time of Joachim Fiore and his views on the end times and how the end of the age of the sun would end in a climactic battle between the Antichrist and angelic hope. And so a lot of people looked at this as, well, maybe he was just off with his calculations. So while by the middle of the 1200s, Joachim Fiore had largely kind of fallen out of favor because the year 1260 had passed. By the 14th century, again, some people turned to apocalyptic visions of maybe this is the end times. So many people died, and so much trouble and turmoil. They didn't last around a long time, but it was a time where a lot of people had very apocalyptic views of society. It probably is no surprise that a lot of people viewed the presence of the Black Plague as a sign of God's wrath. And we're talking about extensive death. It does not appear to, given the lack of medical knowledge, it does not appear to make sense how this thing is spreading. They don't know why it's happening. It's just people very quickly die. So probably, in that mindset, God is engaged in judgment. God's behind the plague. And there were a lot of easy targets for claiming why God was wrathful with Europe. The corruption of the church, for example. The lack of unity among Christians, especially East and West. The failure of the Crusades. All of these were places that people looked at as God is wrathful because of any of these things, and perhaps additional ones as well. Also became a time, of course, of religious doubt. People were really wondering, is God in control? Does God exist? If God exists, why would he allow this to happen, especially to his ministers? And so people became very skeptical, uncertain. If they didn't turn to skepticism, they might turn to a variety of superstitions, occult ways, other types of things that they felt might ward off the Black Plague, buying potions, looking for charms, other things that they could use to make sure that the Black Plague did not meet them. Others turned to pilgrimages, believing that if they traveled to holy sites, that there would be benefits, religious benefits that would extend to their health or the health of a loved one, by going to the Holy Land, by going to other particularly religious sites, that some of the holiness there would transfer over to those people. Yeah, I mean, that's obvious from our standpoint, right? You're just kind of commuting this, but again, they don't understand how it's spreading. They don't have the ideas of communicable diseases like what we do. So, that ended up actually working against the intent. Veneration of relics. Again, these ideas of there's spaces or there are objects that contain holiness, that contain power, and if I can touch those things or I can be in those places, I can receive some of that power to heal me as well. One particular group, however, that tended to be targeted as far as accusations were Jews. it does not appear that the Jewish populations were struck as heavily as Christian populations in Europe. It's unclear exactly why that took place. And scholars have offered a variety of theories. Some have suggested, well, Jews had more cats in Europe, which would make sense. Why, if that's the case, your decreased rat population, the fleas, etc. Others suggested, well, because of the law, if they followed some of the aspects of the law of Moses, there would actually be some better sanitation practices, which would lead to better conditions of health. So there could be a couple of reasons why Jewish populations wouldn't have experienced the same kind of disease and death. However, when you are very fearful, when you are uncertain of what's going on, society seems to be crumbling around you, and here is this group of people that does not seem to be suffering like you are. When a lot of medieval Christians already had prejudices against Jews anyway, they must be responsible for the Black Death. Again, doesn't make it right, but we can say, okay, I can see how somebody would think that. And so often Jews were accused of poisoning wells, for example, the idea being that they poisoned this water and we're drinking this water and this is what's causing it. Other Jews were tortured and during the torture confessed to similar types of crimes to get the torture to end, and so that kind of further reinforced in their mind, okay, see, the Jews really are responsible for this. Thousands of Jews were killed as part of this blaming of the Jews for the responsibility. Some of it was fear. In some places, Christians were indebted to the Jews that were killed. Several popes issued proclamations over the 14th century. The Jews were not responsible for the plague, but the mobs didn't listen to that kind of information. And so it became very much a difficult challenge and a lot of violence enacted against people. In other times of the age we're talking about, there were a lot of incidences of violence and warfare. There's the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453 or 1475, depends on where you want to date it. If you want to date it to the end of, or when Constantinople falls, or there's some other things after that. And yes, that is not 100 years. It is actually like 116 years, or excuse me, 106 years if you go to 1453. No, 16 was right. 116 years if you go to 1453, longer if you date it to 1475. But the 116 Years' War doesn't sound as good as the 100 Years' War. So even it's kind of like, well, it's a rough guess. Essentially, this is primarily the first European war, in the sense of European nations going against each other. Warfare, of course, has been in Europe prior to this point, but often it was Europeans against Muslims, Europeans against the Huns, other types, Europeans against the barbarian tribes. But now, as we're getting into these modern nation states, you have these nations warring against nations. Essentially, the 100 Years' War starts out as a conflict between England and France that will eventually draw in other groups. It started as a dispute over a piece of France that was actually under the control of England. And it had to do with the Norman conquest of England, with William the Conqueror and some other things like that. So parts of France were under the control of English leaders. Furthermore, the French supported the Scots and the Welsh who were trying to get out of English control. So there's a lot of things related to these two countries. The King of England tries to take the French throne and control of Scotland during this time. Orders a variety of invasions of France. Then fighting in Spain would lead to the breaking of a peace treaty that the two nations had signed. Around the same time, a French Civil War breaks out. England gets involved, tries to invade again. So it's back and forth between those two countries over quite a period of time. An interesting religious aspect out of this and all of this is the life of Joan of Arc, who was not Noah's wife. At the age of 12, or perhaps 13, Joan began having visions and hearing voices telling her to essentially take up command of an armed force. And by the age of 18, she had actually become a military leader of French forces, helping to establish the rightful French leader on the throne of France, and gaining the trust of a variety of leaders, including Charles VII. She would go on to lead 4,000 soldiers against the siege of Orleans, which they would finally break through. But she refused to chase fleeing forces on Sunday. So she's got this kind of religious experience, but also military control as well. And due to the breaking of the siege of Orleans, the tide of the war changes. She would go on to capture other cities as well. She would eventually convince Charles VII to attack Paris, which was under English control at the time. And during that fighting, she is wounded by a crossbow. She had previously been wounded in the attempt to establish Charles as the king. Through all of this, she will eventually be captured by the English. The English will put her on trial. They will not put her on trial as a military opponent. They won't put her on trial necessarily as an enemy combatant. Instead, she is put on trial for dressing like a man, communicating with angels, and claiming that she had visions. She is eventually convinced to recant her claims related to hearing visions and seeing angels. And although she's illiterate, she makes a cross on her recantation. But some scholars and others at the time believed that she didn't really understand what she was signing. Eventually, the voices would return and she would kind of recant her recanting. Ultimately, all of this would lead to her being burned at the stake. For a couple of years after her death, two of her brothers, for reasons that I'm not really sure of, attempt to pass off an imposter as their sister. So this is two of her brothers. She's been burned at the stake. They're claiming somebody else is actually their sister. Now maybe it was they received the lavish gifts on her behalf. I mean, people wanting to say, support Joan. But eventually, the imposter admitted the ruse to Charles VII.
What was the reasoning behind Joan of Arc's resurrected? Is that what they're saying?
Not so much that she was resurrected, at least as far as I can tell, but that she had kind of escaped, and that the rumors that she had died had been false.
Did they try to use the imposter as a military leader?
It doesn't appear that it was really used as a military leader, but it seems like the brothers were using her to get these gifts and other things that people wanted to give her because of what she represented. Eventually, she would be retried. And just like we've seen with Pope Formosus, this kind of trial after the fact, in this case, she was exonerated. So it's kind of like this attempt to kind of reconsider her case, even though she's dead. And ultimately, in I believe it's the 1920s, she will be declared a saint by the Catholic Church because of her stance against heresy. She threatens a group of people known as Hussites, who we'll talk about in a couple of classes. And eventually, she even threatens them that if they don't recant their heresy, she will launch a crusade against them. And so in the The later version of this, the memory of this is, let's focus on her, her commitment to orthodoxy, her commitment to the true faith, versus the hearing of vision, or the hearing of voices, the seeing of visions, the not fulfilling proper gender roles or other things that she got in trouble for at the time.